Freedom News Hour Video Edition. I'm Walt Thiessen, your host, along with my special guest host today, Richard Blackwell. Good
Thanks,
friend.
Walt.
Thank you very much for sitting in today. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And we're here to talk about the monetary system. Such a boring topic, but so important because it affects everybody in ways that most people don't even know. So, shall we get to it?
Absolutely.
All right. Let's start off with an analogy. And the analogy we've chosen to use is a tape measure. Why don't you bring up the tape measure? An ordinary Stanley tape measure, nothing unusual here. But there is actually one thing kind of unusual about this tape measure. It's a magic tape measure.
Excellent.
Well, not quite. It's actually a tape measure that we're going to use magic on. You
Even
see,
better.
Richard and I are big Harry Potter fans, and we happen to have acquired Harry Potter's wand. Don't tell anybody. And Richard here has been practicing his Hogwarts magic.
That's true.
And he is about to do a levitation with the tape measure.
All right.
This actually does lead to the monetary system, so bear with us. So let's start with the tape measure on the floor. And why don't you do the levitation?
We'll do a little Wingardium Leviosa.
Ooh, very good. Oh, you're good at this. Oh yeah, I like that. Get it down to the bottom of the screen. Okay, that's good.
Right there.
Oh, really good.
Excellent.
And I love the way that you opened it on the way in. That was pretty good. I mean, you're very skilled at this.
I'm a full-service magician.
No, it's a wizard. It's a
Wizard, pardon me. I'm a wizard. That's right.
Okay, so why a tape measure? Well, as you can see, a tape measure, like any tape measure, is broken up into inches and feet. And this is very important if you're a builder or if you do any kind of home improvement, because you need those inches to always be the same distance apart.
Makes sense.
If they aren't always 1 inch apart, the way that an inch has always been, it's kind of hard to build things.
Yeah.
Works just the same if you're using centimeters and millimeters. It has to be the same
Sure.
length for the centimeters and millimeters. And in fact, if we tried to build a house with a tape measure that had shrunk, let's shrink the tape measure. Can you do the shrinking chart?
All right, absolutely. How about a little reducio?
Oh, very good. Get it down to about half the size. Oh, good. That's good. Right there.
Nice.
Okay. So, and I chose half the size just because it makes it a little bit easier to visualize the math and so forth.
Okay.
If we were to take a tape measure, build the first half of the house at normal size, and then reduce the tape measure to half its size, basically all of our measurements would double
Right.
in order to keep them what was the same length before.
Makes sense.
That's not a good thing.
No.
We agree on that. Builders couldn't build. Nothing would. Buildings would just fall over. It'd
Right.
Be really disastrous.
Very least lopsided.
Talk about an economic disaster. Okay. Let's put the tape measure down. If you lower it down again. Thank you very much.
Down we
Okay.
go.
And you'll notice I put that Benjamin Franklin $100 bill down there.
Ah, excellent.
Would you bring that back up onto the screen?
Absolutely. Wingardium Leviosa. And there.
And at the bottom. Good.
Right
Okay,
there.
good. Now, we want to do the same thing here. We want to reduce it to 50%.
Think we can do that?
Yep.
Reducio.
Very nice. Oh, perfect. Right on 50%. Really good. You're good at this. Have you done this before?
A few times.
A few times, okay. Well, when we're talking about what happens with a monetary system, money doesn't actually reduce in size.
No.
But it does reduce in value.
How does that happen?
That's what we're about to talk about. And this example shows, as sort of an analogy, if you reduce the value of your money, what happens to it? The purchasing power
It goes way down.
goes down.
Yeah.
In fact, it goes down proportionate to how much value you lost. That's
Makes
why
sense.
it's so important for our monetary supply, our complete money supply, to be relatively stable and steady. If we mess with that, just like we messed with the tape measure, it would make it very difficult, actually almost impossible, to accurately measure the cost of goods and services.
Sure. Okay.
Because we count on a steady, stable dollar in order for the measurements to make sense to us. Otherwise, we wouldn't know what to ask for a salary if we got hired for a job, or how much to pay for a new car, or how much to pay for a new home, or how much to buy groceries for, because the values would be meaningless. It has to be stable and steady. Would you be surprised to learn that the average economist is not so concerned about whether or not the dollar stays steady?
How is that not a fundamental thing of economics?
You would think it would be. You would think that when it comes to defining what constitutes good money, that retaining value would be an important part of it. You would be shocked to find out that not only economists, but bankers, financial experts, politicians, do not consider it to be a primary definition of what constitutes money.
Holy cow.
It's really a very strange thing, but it also happens to be true. What happens if we, instead of reducing the size of the money, what if we actually reduce the value by 50%?
It would take twice as much money to purchase goods and services.
That's
I would
right.
think.
How is that accomplished?
I have no idea.
It's accomplished by increasing the money supply.
Well, why would you increase the money supply?
Well, before we even go into why, let's talk about why the mechanism happens.
Okay.
Let's say there's $100 million in the world.
All right.
And then with a flick of the Harry Potter wand, there's now 200 million. That means
Okay.
there's more money chasing goods and services.
Okay.
So it's going to take more money to buy them.
All right. Stands to
That's
reason.
the way it works. That's basic supply and demand. So of
Okay.
course, if you increase the money supply, you're going to decrease the spending power. You're going to increase costs. It's going to be a direct relationship.
That doesn't. But why would one do this? That I mean,
Why would one manipulate the money supply?
Absolutely.
Oh, it's very profitable to do it.
Of course it is.
Of course it is, yes. Do you know how money that is created... Well, first of all, do you know who controls the money supply?
Oh, well, that would be Congress.
No, that's the Federal Reserve.
Ah, the Federal is part of the... Wait a minute. How does that happen?
Well, the Federal Reserve was created by an act of Congress in 1913.
Okay, so they're federal.
Well, sort of. They're federal by name. They're actually a private organization created by the bankers.
We've given our money to private banks, then let them control it?
They not only control it, they decide how much of it there's going to be.
Why would we do that?
That's a good question. If there are no more questions, class is dismissed.
Oh my goodness.
No, seriously. Let's go to 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created. And the question that should be in your mind is, why was the Federal Reserve created?
That is a good question. Why did we create the Fed?
Sure. And the answer is, there were a series of economic crises, similar to the
Okay.
financial crisis of 2008, leading up to the creation of the Fed in 1913, the most recent one being the financial panic of 1907. And there were panics going back into the turn of the century, rather. The millennium was 2000, and going back to even the 1890s. 1893 was a major panic. It was also a panic where a banker of dubious note came to the public eye in a new way. His name was J.P. Morgan.
I've heard of him.
Yes, a lot of us have heard of J.P. Morgan. He's one of the early money trust bankers, one of the biggest bankers, one of the most powerful in the country. And J.P. Morgan did a wonderful thing. When the panic happened in 1893, he bailed out the banks that were in trouble.
Personally?
Personally. But he wouldn't do it anymore after that, because he wasn't quite the philanthropist that he wanted us to believe.
Right.
Yes. What he did instead was to help press for the creation of the Federal Reserve, which went into effect 20 years later.
Interesting.
Interestingly enough, the year he died.
It is odd.
Very odd. Of course, that wasn't the end of J.P. Morgan, because he also had a son, J.P. Morgan, who carried on his father's legacy. He was almost the more famous J.P. Morgan after that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so there's actually two of them. Like the world needs more than one.
Right.
So anyway, getting back to our story about why the Federal Reserve was created. It was created because of these bank panics. And
All
the
right.
argument was that if you create a Federal Reserve as a central bank, where the banks would keep a certain portion of their deposits on reserve, so to speak, then if there was ever a panic, the Federal Reserve could take that money, put it into the hands of the banks that were in trouble, and eliminate the problem.
All right. Well, it's on paper. It seems like a good thing.
It does seem like a good thing, doesn't it? Except for one thing.
What is that?
When they when they give them the money, there's usually not enough in the reserve to do it when there's a big financial crisis, so they have to create the money out of thin air.
Ah.
And when you create money out of thin air, what do you do to the money supply?
Like you said, we are increasing the money
It increases
supply,
it.
and that it decreases our purchasing power.
Right. So
Okay.
essentially, whenever the Federal Reserve bails out the banks, they're doing it at our expense.
Well, maybe it's time for us to stop bailing out the banks,
No,
or maybe
I would
even
agree with that.
prevent the banks from getting in trouble in the first place.
And that raises another question. How do the banks get in trouble in the first place?
How?
Well, there's a very strange thing about banks. and it's been going on for hundreds of years. It's not new. There are a lot of commentators who would have you believe that it's new, but it's not. Do you know what happens if you make a deposit at the bank?
Well, I take my $100 into the bank, or my $1,000 or whatever it is. I give it to them, and they hold on to it, and then give me a little bit of interest on it, like 0.1% or something.
If it goes into a savings account, if it goes into a checking account, it just
sits there.
Yeah.
Okay, but it sits there.
Right. Except it doesn't just sit there. They lend it out.
It's my money.
Yeah, but they lend it out anyway. And that's the strange practice that I was referring to. It's
They're lending out my money?
Yeah, they're lending out your money. And everybody else's money, too.
Why? How? How is that even legal?
It's been legal since the creation of the Bank of England in the 1600s.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been legal for a long, long time. It's essentially fraudulent, but it's legal.
It sounds fraudulent to me.
Well, sure, because the money never belonged to them in the first place.
It didn't.
Yet they're lending it out, they're collecting the interest, they're keeping the lion's share of the interest.
They're collecting interest on my money.
That's right.
All right.
It's amazing, isn't it?
All right.
So, all right. So we're touching a little bit on the beginnings here of what's going on. It actually gets worse than that, though.
Oh, boy.
Well, when a bank takes in your $1,000 deposit,
Okay.
they record it on a balance sheet.
All right.
And they put it on the liability side because they owe you the money. It's their liability.
All right, it's not an asset, it's a liability. They owe it back to me because it's mine. Okay.
Right. But then when they lend it out again, it also goes on the asset side.
But it's the same $1,000. You're telling me this is the liability
It's on the
and
liability
an
side,
asset?
and it's on the asset side. And effectively, that creates new money. Because before there was $1,000, and now you've loaned out some of that $1,000, maybe almost all of it. So now it's almost $2,000 created out of thin air just by depositing your money in a bank that lends it out.
Wow.
So the commercial banks engage in the practice of making money out of thin air
Apparently.
just by taking in deposits and making loans.
Wow, they don't even have to print new money. They
No.
just take in deposits.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then some of that money that got loaned out circulates through, comes back as deposits, and gets loaned out again. And it becomes sort of a circulating thing. It's not endless because they do have to keep a certain amount on reserve. That's why they call it a Federal Reserve, right?
Right, so
They
they
have
have
to keep
some kind of reserve.
There's a small amount that's kept on reserve, and that's the part that supposedly is used to bail out the banks if things go wrong. Except when
But
things
it's
get
not,
bad.
because by the time a bank goes wrong, they've already lent out all the money. There is no money to bail out the bank.
Pretty much.
Great.
You know, if it's a small enough problem, then yes, they have enough to handle it. But if it's a large problem like there was in 2008, then they don't have enough to cover it. Or if it's a large problem like there was in 1929. And you know what happened in 1929.
The stock market
Stock market crashed, and there was the Great Depression. And during that time, leading up to 1929, and during 1929, 1930, 1931, and so forth, huge numbers of banks were failing. They were failing by the thousands.
How do thousands of banks fail
It's
all
amazing.
at once?
It's amazing, isn't it? And it wasn't just all at once. It was spread out over a decade, actually.
Okay.
Every single year, banks were failing. So it wasn't just like this one great big implosion that happened in 1929.
There was sort of a run-up.
It was a run-up, yeah.
Okay.
Up until that time, they were still failing by the hundreds and thousands. So it was a very serious problem. And you ask how they fail? Well,
Yes.
it's pretty simple. How does any bank fail? If you're in the process, if you're in the business of taking people's deposits and lending them out and then promising to give them their deposits back on demand, and those loans end up not getting repaid, what happens?
There's no more money to pay back the money they owe people.
And that's what leads to what's known as a run on the bank.
I see.
Which
Because everybody's
is-
coming in asking
That's
for their
right.
deposits. Their deposits have been lent out. Now
That's
there's no money. Everyone's going crazy.
Exactly. That's what a run on the bank
Okay.
is. And that's what caused the financial panic of 1893, financial panics leading up to 1904, 1907, and leading up to the creation of the Federal Reserve. Because they made the loans that they thought were good loans at the time, but later on turned out to be not good loans. A lot of losses piled up. Word got out. Depositors said, I need to get my money back. Go to the
Right.
bank. Not enough money to go around, run on the
And
bank.
then
Bank gets closed
crash.
down.
Okay.
And most of the banks that failed in the 1920s were community banks, mostly out in the Midwest. Why out in the Midwest? Well, because that's where the farmers are.
Right.
Farmers regularly were involved in borrowing money in order to fund their farming practices.
Okay.
And if the food crop was bad, or the market was bad,
Sure,
or
they
something
need a
went
loan or
wrong, a
something.
hurricane, tornado, whatever it might be, they might not be able to repay their loans.
Okay.
And that happened on a fairly regular
Okay.
basis. It's actually also true that Federal Reserve action contributed to that, but there's also a lot of dispute about that. So we'll skate over that part. We don't want to get too controversial here.
All
We
right.
want to stick with the stuff that we know to be 100% true. Bottom line is banks were failing left and right.
Okay.
And notice that they were failing left and right after the creation of the Federal Reserve.
Which was created to bail them out in the first place,
Right.
to keep them from. Okay.
And what's particularly surprising is the Fed actually did very little to protect any of those banks.
That's what it was supposed to do.
Right. But the reason it didn't protect any of them is that most of them were not members of the Federal Reserve. They were there to protect their own membership. Who do you think are in the membership of the Federal Reserve?
They're probably like the good old boy network or something.
It is. It's the good old boy network. It's the big banks primarily in New York.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. Yeah. Today, it has gotten to the point where the vast majority of commercial banks are members, although even that is a closely guarded secret. We're not able to access any public records showing who the actual owners of the Fed are. So all we can
How
really
is
go
that?
on,
They're public records.
they're owned by the Fed.
Unbelievable.
The Fed is a privately owned organization that has been delegated power by Congress.
Oops.
Yeah, oops indeed. Okay, so you can begin to see this monster that Congress created.
Yeah.
And you can see the effect it's having. It's allowing them to create money out of thin air as banks. The individual banks are allowed to do that. It's creating a structure which is supposed to protect us when the banks go wrong by lending out money that never belonged to them in the first place, money that we deposited.
It's supposed to protect us, and it's wind up not
And it's not
protecting us at all.
us, right? And in fact, it's leading to the Great Depression. Even though most economists, remember, most economists don't care too much about what happens to the value of the dollar, because they don't define that as part of the value of the dollar, or they don't define it as part of what the dollar is, what money is.
Incredible.
So, yeah, it's a pretty bad scenario all the way around. Okay. We haven't touched on the second way that money is created out of thin air.
Okay.
Commercial banks do it by lending out money that we deposit.
Right. I put the deposit in, they lend it out, and
That's
now
right.
they've doubled the money, so to speak.
That's right, yes.
So they've created new money.
Right. But there's a second way, and the second way is the Federal Reserve itself is empowered by Congress to create money.
How do they do that?
Believe it or not, they do it with practically a stroke of the pen, or these days, a stroke of the keyboard key on the computer.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, essentially what the Fed does, if the order goes out from the Federal Open Market Committee, that's the one that governs Fed decisions.
Okay.
That's the one that Ben Bernanke is chairman of.
All right.
If they make a decision that the money supply needs to be increased in some way, or to some degree, they send an order to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. That's the bank that handles all these various transactions. They say, okay, create $100 billion. We need $100 billion right now. So create, and the Bank of New York says, okay, well, got $100 billion, it's put into the computer. Okay, now loan it out. Well, who are we going to loan it out to? Loan it out to the federal government. That's who a lot of it's loaned out to.
They're creating money out of thin air and then giving it to the government, but they're not giving it to the government, they're loaning it to the government.
Right.
Fake money that never existed, they're creating out of thin air, and not only are they giving it to the government to spend, which is reducing the purchasing power of all of our dollars,
Right.
but the Fed's collecting interest on it.
You got it.
How is this not a scam?
I can't say that it's not.
Oh, man.
What can I say? Of course it's a scam.
Okay.
But it's legal. It's 100% legal because Congress authorized
fraud.
it.
Wonderful.
Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about the constitutional side, but there's a very strong argument to be made that these activities of Congress to give all this power to the Fed was really pushing the boundaries of the Constitution, and perhaps, many people would say actually violate the Constitution.
It sounds like it's violated it to me.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fairly easy argument to make. I mean, the Constitution, especially in Article 1, Section 10, basically prohibits the states from
coining their own money,
from coining their own money,
yeah.
from coining their own money, from using anything but gold or silver as money,
Right.
from emitting bills of credit. A bill of credit is another word for money, for paper money. That's what a bill of credit is. As a matter of fact, did you know that $100 bill that we had on screen a few minutes back there, that's actually very little more than a promissory note because it was issued as a form of a loan.
Oh, man.
So, anyway, the Constitution prohibits the states from doing that.
Yes, it does.
The only problem is, and this is where the federal government was able to kind of sneak it under the radar, so to speak, the Constitution doesn't actually say that the federal government is prohibited from engaging in these things. It only prohibits states from engaging in these things.
Oh,
now, when the delegates met at the Constitutional Convention in 1789, it was very clear from all their debates and so forth that they really wanted to stop all this kind of thing.
Right.
To this day, I don't know why they worded it so that only the states were prohibited.
Yeah.
They should have prohibited the federal government too,
Yeah.
but they didn't. So that's the loophole that the Federal Reserve was created under.
Okay.
But I don't think there's any doubt that the Fed, the paper money system, the debt-based monetary system, violates the spirit, the intention of the Constitution. There's no doubt about that. The founders clearly did not want this kind of thing to happen.
Right.
So
And with good reason, apparently.
And there are some people who will claim, well, it's unconstitutional anyway, and they'll make various arguments for it.
Right.
We could go back and forth about that one. The important point here, though, is that what's being done with our money that we deposit in banks is harming us and profiting the bankers.
That sounds like exactly what's happening.
That's exactly what's happening. Okay, so we've covered the two ways that money is created out of thin air. And we talked a little bit about the history of the Fed. And let me just check my notes here, about what happened with the Panic of 1907 and so forth, and how their activities increased the money supply.
Right.
The crash of 1929 happened. Of course, the Fed contributed to this in a number of different ways, and it led Congress to decide to come up with a secondary solution. They didn't want to get rid of the Federal Reserve, but they did want to provide sort of a secondary buffer, and that's where the FDIC comes from.
And that's the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation?
That's right, exactly. And do you know how the FDIC works?
I have no idea. I'm lucky I remember what it stood for.
Well, you did very well. The FDIC basically collects premiums from the banks, similar to the way insurance works.
Okay.
And those premiums are held aside, and if a bank fails, they use that money that's held aside to cover the losses, and then they sell off the rest of the bank to another bank.
Okay.
That's how the FDIC protects everybody's investment. You know, their savings are protected up to, what, $250,000 now. And that sounds like a pretty good scheme, doesn't it? Except there is one problem, and that is, unlike regular insurance, let's say, for instance, if you have car insurance.
Okay.
With car insurance, they don't just charge you a premium based on the value of your car, do they? They also base it on how good a driver you are.
Sure. Your history, how many accidents you've had.
Exactly, exactly. Well, they don't do the same thing with the banks. With the banks, they only base the premium on how much they have on deposit. They don't base it on whether or not the banks are making smart loans.
There's no decision there's nothing affecting their decision on whether or not a bank is good at what they do or bad at what they do.
That's right, exactly. Yep. Instead, what we have essentially is a system where the banks that do a poorer job of making good loan decisions are covered by the banks that do a better job. So in other words, you have the banks doing a better job subsidizing the banks that do a poorer job. And that's not an insurance situation anymore, is it?
Wow, no.
That's what they call it in the insurance industry. They call it a moral hazard, because now you don't have an incentive to not do the wrong thing. Did we talk about the Fed's mandate? There's actually a dual mandate. Yeah.
Okay, so what we would think to bail out the banks.
Actually, believe it or not, that's
not even part of it. Of course not.
No. The mandate is, first of all, to keep unemployment low.
Okay.
And second of all, to keep inflation low.
You would think those would be good things.
You would think those are good things, wouldn't you? And you'd be right, they are good things. The problem is that if you're the one who's controlling the money supply and you're constantly increasing it as a matter of policy, which is exactly
what's happening,
then you are contributing directly to inflation, aren't you? Because ultimately, if you keep devaluing the dollar, if you keep debasing the dollar, it's going to show up as higher prices over time.
Right, because it's going to take more and more of these dollars to purchase goods and services. So that's creating inflation. Wow.
Yeah, that's the real root of inflation. We think of inflation as being the increase in prices, but really at its root, it's inflation to the monetary system, to the money supply, a few years before.
Wow, okay.
And in fact, we're going to show you a graph in a few minutes. Maybe we should show the graph now.
Sure.
Okay, let me get the graph up here on the computer. This is a graph that comes from the St. Louis Fed.
All right.
All right. And as you can see, this goes back to 1980. And you can see we have a fairly steady curve going up here as the money supply is increasing.
What is that?
This? This is Federal Reserve's answer to the financial crisis of 2008.
You're kidding.
I'm not kidding. The way that they solved the crisis is by creating a whole pile of new money.
That's the amount of money, and
Now, this is what's known as the monetary base. Let me explain.
so the money that's out in the
this,
world.
This is all physical currency in the world.
Okay.
It doesn't count the bank deposits.
All right.
It doesn't count stuff that's being held overseas in terms of government bonds and so forth. All it counts
All
is
right.
just the basic currency in the world.
Okay.
And basic currency, as you can see, had been increasing as it's been increasing ever since the founding of the Fed, except in 2008, when the crisis hit us, they doubled the money supply, and it's actually up to the point where it's tripled.
So instead of adding $100 or $200 million, they've added 10 trillion.
It's not quite 10 trillion, but it's close. We were around 800 billion in 2008, and now we're up to almost 2.5 trillion. That's just the monetary base.
Unbelievable.
And the other thing about that graph that we were looking at, as I said before, the Fed has been increasing the money supply pretty steadily up until 2008, and then it skyrocketed.
And then it
as you
just,
point out.
wow.
Yeah. During the time, though, before the skyrocket, up until that point, at the beginning of 2008, did you know that the dollar, since the Fed's creation in 1913, has lost 96% of its value?
You're telling me that my dollar, a $1 bill in my wallet, is worth 4 cents?
Compared to the 1913 dollar, yeah. Your dollar is worth 4 cents in 1913.
Holy cow.
And you can
So all of
imagine-
my dollars have been devalued by this.
Right. But what most people in the financial circles keep saying is, well, yeah, those basic things for, paying your rent, paying your food, paying for your clothing, those kinds of things have gone up. The stuff that you absolutely have to pay on a daily basis.
Right.
But most of the economy hasn't gone up. And that's why they point to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and say, well, it's only going up about 1 or 2% a year. So everything's okay, according to them. But it never happens instantly. It's not like they created the money in 2008, and by 2009, the prices are taking off.
No.
Because it takes a while for the money
everything
to
to
get
catch
into.
up,
Yeah,
right.
it takes a while for the money to get going to drive the price up. It has to
Okay,
happen
yeah.
through transactions. Well, it's about to happen. We're making this video in April 2011.
Right.
Just yesterday, the CEO of Walmart announced that there's going to start being major inflation in Walmart pricing
Really?
in June 2011. So by the time
Wow.
most people see this video, they will know that the inflation has already started to kick in.
And they're also going to know it's not because of some mysterious influence, it's because the Fed's tripled the monetary base.
Well, they won't necessarily know that. They'll know it because they're watching this video.
Right.
But if you listen to the media,
They won't tell you.
what the media will tell them is it's Libya, it's Japan, it's the troubles in the Middle East, it's China.
Oh, God, it's the war in Iraq.
It's anybody
Oh,
except
man.
the money supply. Money supply, that can't be it.
No.
So we won't ever talk about that.
Wow.
Wonders of the word.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow, indeed. It's
Oh, my God.
I know, it's shocking stuff, to say the least. And how has the Fed done in terms of keeping unemployment under control, particularly since the financial crisis of 2008, which is the one kind of thing that the Fed was created to help protect us from?
Right. My guess is it hasn't, because we've seen unemployment rising for, I don't know, consistently for the past 150 years.
Well, especially we've seen it rising for the last 3 years since the financial crisis hit.
Right.
So you don't have to guess. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
I mean, they've done a terrible job of keeping unemployment under control. In fact, that's the one thing that Chairman Ben Bernanke actually addresses in his comments to the public.
And I'll place today's policy decision in the context of the committee's projections and the Federal Reserve's statutory mandate to foster maximum employment and price stability.
So anyway, let me go back to my my outline here. Okay, have you had a chance to recover?
No. How do you recover from something like this?
Well, I think the most important thing is to say, if you know what the real cause is, you can't be taken in anymore.
All right, well, sure.
That's why we're making this
power.
video.
Yeah.
Knowledge is power. So, I mean, just by making this video and getting people to circulate it and so forth, pass it around the net, because we're making this available as a free video, just by doing that, we are enabling the power of the people. We're basically educating people so that they know what they're really dealing with.
I like it. Let's do it.
And by the way, there is actually a bill before Congress that addresses a lot of these problems.
Is there?
There really is. The one core issue, of course, is why is it the banks get to lend out money that we deposit in them?
Yeah.
Because that's really where the whole thing starts. But it addresses almost all the rest of it. And that is a bill that is put into the House of Representatives by Congressman Ron Paul of Texas.
Yeah, like him.
You like Ron?
Yeah,
Okay.
I do.
Well, his bill is called the Free Competition in Currency Act of 2011.
Okay.
It's H.R. 1098. And,
H.R. 1098, all right.
And what that bill does is, well, it does a few things. First of all, it enables us to no longer have to use the dollar as currency if we don't want to anymore.
We could use gold and silver.
We can use gold, we can use silver, we can use
Okay.
privately minted money, we could use whatever we want. Because right now it's illegal to use anything except the U.S. dollar.
Right.
The laws are carefully structured that way.
Okay.
That's a really key thing because the biggest impact is how this affects the dollars that you and I hold
Mm-hmm.
and the dollars that we earn. Not all forms of alternatives to the dollar are illegal. I should qualify.
Okay.
It's illegal to use gold and silver as money. Gold and silver coins are definitely out according to Title, I think it's Title 18, Section 486 of the U.S. Code. But it's also legal to create your own money if you're creating the kind of money that can be inflated. As long as you're not going to create a currency that's actually better than the dollar, then you can create it. It's okay.
That's interesting.
And in fact, there are a few small currencies that circulate around the country. There's actually one that was created as a barter currency in Ithaca, New York, and it's still in circulation today.
Wow.
However, they also do inflate their own currency, so it has the same kind of problems. I mean, once you have a currency like that, it's very tempting to keep inflating it. If you turn it around so that the money that we're earning can't be devalued, can't be debased, then we no longer have to suffer for what the banks do.
All right, I'm all about it.
That's really, really key. So that's a very important portion.
That's a good
of it.
step.
That's a very good step. It's not enough. I've actually considered contacting Congressman Paul's office to suggest add something to the bill that basically prohibits the banks from lending out money that doesn't belong to them. Or at least, more precisely, what needs to happen is if you go to a bank and you deposit money that's going to be loaned out, you have to consent to that.
Right, sure.
And you have to agree that while the money is out there, you can't get it back.
Okay.
Because that's what an investment truly is.
Okay.
I mean, if you go invest in, General Motors,
Right.
the only way you can get your money back is if you can sell your share to
Sell the
somebody
stock,
else.
right.
Right. But there's nothing, you can't sell your deposit to somebody else. There's no market for that.
Right.
It's not permitted.
No.
So you have to have some way to commit that as long as that loan is repaid, you're committed to it. Now, what that will do is it will enable the possibility of creating a market where you can sell that off at a discount, and you'd have to, suffer some sort of loss to get rid of it.
Sure.
But nevertheless, you could at least get out from under it. The key thing, though, is taking away from the banks the power to use money that they never earned, so that they can create money out of thin air. Because that's where you get that multiplier effect. Remember, you deposit your money, they put it on the liability side.
And then they turn it into an asset by loaning it out. Right. Makes sense.
So now it becomes a much more controlled situation, and you don't have the most important thing of all. You don't have any more bank panics.
Right.
Which means you don't need the Federal Reserve
anymore. Okay.
Which means that the commercial banks can no longer create money out of thin air anymore. Which means the Federal Reserve can't create money out of thin air. Which means we have the one thing we started this whole program with, a level, stable money supply.
Right.
And the advantage to a level, stable money supply, well, there are legions of advantages. Can you
we know what our prices are going to be. I know what salary to ask for and how much I should be paying for a gallon of gas and a loaf of bread.
Absolutely. We also know a few other things.
What are those?
If you have a level, stable money supply, first of all, goods and services are constantly increasing.
Okay.
People are making new goods and services all the time.
Sure.
Right? That means the overall supply of stuff that you can buy is growing.
All right.
If the overall supply keeps growing and the money supply stays constant, what happens to the price of those things?
Oh, you would think they would have to come down.
They would. And that's what's supposed to happen in a free market economy. They don't even teach that anymore.
No.
But they used to teach
I've never
that.
even heard of it.
But it's true.
But
It's
the more goods and services we put out, if we
It should
do
be
have
cheaper and
stable
cheaper.
money, things will get more inexpensive.
Which is what's supposed to happen in a free market economy.
Which is
Remember, a
what
free
we
market
want.
economy, this is what the free market economists were arguing for years. They said a free market economy benefits everybody because it spreads the benefits of freedom to everybody.
Right, sure.
And yet our experience is just the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Our experience is that the
benefits
more
to
that
the
we have
Federal
the
Reserve.
economy, the poorer we all get.
Yeah.
And so we figure, well, that must be the free market's fault.
No,
But it's not the
it's
free
not.
market's fault because it wasn't a free market. It's not a free market if you have a currency that's constantly expanding
No,
at the whim of some central bankers.
Yeah.
There's no way that can be a free market.
no, it's not a free market.
It's going to work directly against what a free market is supposed to
It's
do.
a controlled
To distribute.
scam masquerading
That's
as a free market.
Some of the other benefits of having a stable, steady money supply, well, the big banks and the corporations, they gain and retain much less negative influence over us.
Ah, like
That's
the sound
big.
of that.
That's really big.
Like the sound of that.
What do you think would happen with poverty? If we had a level, stable money supply, and the prices are coming down over time, and the value of your currency is held over time,
Right, the poverty's even going to decrease. I mean,
It's
we're
gonna
even
decrease.
looking at, and as the competition is coming about that brings down these lower prices, now we have even more jobs for these people.
in fact, what also happens is you end up with people taking on more and more leisure time
Excellent.
because they don't have to constantly
Right,
run in the rat race. Why do people run in the rat race? Because they're trying to keep up.
right.
They're trying to keep up with the loss of the value of the dollar. They don't think of it that way. They're trying to, they have these goals, and the goals seem to be farther and farther and farther
Sure.
away. They don't realize it's because of the money supply. So you level the money supply, and now all of a sudden there's no more need to have a rat race.
Oh, wow, wouldn't that be nice?
Boy, that would be fantastic.
Man,
Absolutely
I'd give up
fantastic.
my second job.
What would happen to the military-industrial complex?
I don't know.
Where do they get their money?
Well, Fed just makes it and then loans it to the banks, or loans it to the Federal Reserve makes it and then loans it to the federal government, so the federal government can just spend it however they choose, and
It's virtually an unlimited money supply for the federal
Right.
government.
yeah,
I mean, to heck with taxes.
yeah,
Taxes almost become a minor point when you get to a certain point in the ability to create money out of thin
Right.
air. So basically what happens is the military-industrial complex stops growing.
wow,
That would be pretty cool.
yeah, it would be.
It'd be cool to have a defense system that was actually based on defense. For
On defense, right?
That'd be something.
Yeah, instead of picking up some tiny little country and throwing it against the wall every 5-10 years.
So there's a few more benefits. Let's see, are there any other benefits? Oh yeah, there is one. There's a really big one. Well, I guess it depends on your point of view, but I think most people feel that government has gotten too big.
Way too big.
Yeah, I think most people are in that boat. They will disagree on how big government should be, but I
Right.
think the vast majority think it's gotten too big. Well, government gets big because they're able to create money out of
Right.
the air through the Federal Reserve. Take away that power, and you've just placed a limit on the ability of the government to keep growing like crazy.
Yeah.
You've just blocked it from happening. And now everybody has to focus on, okay, how are we going to have the government live within its means?
Mm.
Because the bailout isn't there anymore.
Right.
There's
right.
no
They'll
more
actually
bailout.
have to.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Another benefit of having a stable, steady money supply is that quality increases. Do you realize how much better manufacturing quality used to be compared to where it is today?
Yeah. Now things it's almost like they're made to break, so they can sell more of them.
Sure. Yeah. That's not by
Yeah.
accident.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
That's not by accident. But when you are no longer dependent on a rat race that is caused by a grouping of money in the hands of a few,
Mhm.
who are basically pulling the puppet strings of the world,
Okay.
and where people have more control over their labor as a result and their time as a result, the net result of all that is that people are going to take more time to do their craft better.
And since we will also have more time to shop for the better quality goods.
That's true. Yeah. And hold manufacturers to a higher
To a
standard.
higher standard. I like it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of those benefits that kind of sneaks up on you because you don't really realize it at first. But in fact,
Wow.
a free market economy, if we had one, which we
If
don't
we had
currently
one.
have, should actually keep improving the quality of goods and services, because if you can't get rich by borrowing a ton of money in order to go into business and corner the market, then the only thing left at that point
is to make good products.
is to make better product. Yeah.
Wow.
Which is what an economy is supposed to do.
With this stable monetary supply,
Yeah.
we'd have less work, more leisure time, a smaller government, less poverty, and better goods and services.
And what would happen with, say, war and peace issues?
I think there would be a lot more of the latter.
Yeah, a lot less of the former.
Right.
War depends heavily upon bankers to fund them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Take away the ability
if the military-industrial complex, all they got to do is turn the crank or swipe the pin, and poof, they got another $1 billion to buy whatever it is they need.
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, the war in Iraq was costing $1 billion a week.
That's right.
And that money's got to come from, no, it doesn't have to come from somewhere. It comes from nowhere. That's right. We just
That's true. It comes from nowhere. They created it out of thin air.
just explained that.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, great.
And by the way, I want to emphasize here, when we speak against the military-industrial complex, we're not speaking against people who serve in the military.
Oh, of course not. Absolutely not.
I mean, you served in the
I
military.
served in the military.
You were in the Marines, weren't
I
you?
am a Marine. It's
You're a
true.
Marine, yeah. I guess you're always a Marine once you're a Marine.
Once a Marine, always a Marine, Walt.
That's right.
That's true.
Yeah. So this is something that affects everybody, including the people who serve their country.
Yeah. Well, I'd like my military to be serving our country, not invading other countries for what's really come down to absolutely no reason whatsoever.
Well, there is a reason.
Oh, right. Saddam Hussein threatened George H.W. Bush. That's right. Yeah, here's a man who once threatened my daddy. Oh, great. That's fantastic.
Well, more
reason.
accurately, it's because it enriches the powerful.
Right.
There's a
Which
lot
is why
of power in
which
money.
is why they are absolutely do not want any of us to have this kind of information.
That's right. This is the root of all their power. Take away this root, undercut this root, and like with any plant, you cut the taproot and the plant dies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the people in power want to stay in power.
They do.
Yeah.
They do.
And the rich want to stay rich.
Well, do you have a better idea now of what really caused the financial crisis of 2008? Because
Infinitely
ultimately,
better,
that's the
yeah.
purpose of addressing the question of the money supply.
Right.
I mean, up until now, you have been told that the financial crisis was caused by foolish lending practices,
Right.
by subprime mortgages. Right?
Yeah. Subprime mortgages probably had nothing to do with it,
by
or
credit-
very little.
Well, they did have something to do with it, but they weren't the root cause.
They weren't the cause.
Yeah, they were definitely involved. There was no doubt that subprime mortgages happened, that they were bad loans and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But to say that that's what caused the financial crisis really ignores the fact that the banks couldn't have made those bad loans in the first place if they didn't have access to your deposits without your permission.
Right.
And
Right.
without the permission
Or
of everybody
knowledge.
else. Or knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah. Most people don't even realize that they have that.
Unbelievable.
And those people who do realize it don't realize, in many cases, that that gives the banks the power to increase the money supply
Right.
by lending it out. It's a crazy system. Well, hopefully we've answered some questions here. Hopefully we've educated some people.
Yeah, I hope so.
All right.
Educated me, I knew that.
And we're going to, this is the first in a series of videos. Look for more videos in the very near future, because we're going to start breaking down in more detail some of the things we
Excellent.
talked about, and how
Excellent.
we're going to explain how they're actually being applied in our current real life situation, especially now that we're beginning to enter a period of high inflation,
All right.
a period that's going to affect all of us.
Right. And
dreadfully.
it's not Libya's fault, and it's not the earthquake
right.
in Japan.
Those are all symptoms of what happens along the way,
Right.
but they aren't
That's
the root
not
cause.
the cause.
They're not the root cause.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Richard,
My
for
pleasure,
joining us
Walt.
today. And we'll see you next time on the Freedom News Hour Surviving Meltdown. Goodbye, everybody.